Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. I'm Brielle, the Associate Director for the CSIS Wadhwani AI Center, back again to chat about recent news in AI. In this episode, we'll discuss what key AI companies want from the Trump administration's AI Action Plan, the latest report from the California Policy Working Group on AI frontier models, and why computer programming jobs are just vanishing. So let's jump right in with the AI Action Plan, RFI. On March 15th, the response window for the White House AI Action Plan Request for Information, RFI, had closed. But before we dive into what those responses look like, Greg, can you give me some background on what we know about the AI Action Plan so far?
Sure. So the Trump administration has already passed a bunch of executive orders, literally more than 100. A couple of those deal with AI. The first executive order was to repeal the Biden administration's AI executive order. And the second one is about, securing American leadership in AI. And it's going to culminate in this thing called the AI Action Plan. So in our earlier podcast, we described it as planning to plan. Part of that process, and this is very classic government policy making, sausage making, is getting a lot of inputs from various folks. So on February 25th, the Trump administration released an RFI that stands for Request for Information, which is basically like telling every company, telling every civil society organization, telling every random dude in America, hey, if you want to weigh in on our executive order, this is your time, put it in the record. Well, Lynn Parker, who is at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, also served in the Office of Science and Technology Policy during the first Trump administration, during actually part of the Biden administration as well. She has gotten a lot of responses, more than 8,755 responses. So can you imagine, being the team that is in charge of making sure that every voice is heard on the American AI Action Plan?
No, we sometimes struggle to read through 8,000 of our own words, let alone other reports.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can't say this with any definitive, proof or anything like that, but wouldn't surprise me if a large language model is involved in parsing some of these answers. Who knows how they're going to approach it? But anyway, they got a boatload of responses, and this is basically every company's lobbyists, every civil society organization saying, do this, don't do that. And you learn a lot just by seeing what companies weigh in on what issues, using what language. And some of this stuff is like pretty boring. Hey, you should have a strategy that takes into account our many fine products, right? Like that is not especially interesting. But some of the stuff is pretty juicy. And so I think that's why it's going to be great to unpack it here.
So with those more than 8,000 responses, who are the types of folks who responded to those, that request for information, and what did they say?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of interesting. There are more people who responded than we're going to be able to talk about on this podcast. And that's because some of the people who responded went ahead and made their responses public. So the same thing that the Trump administration received, in that email inbox or whatever, is the same thing that they put on their website for anyone and everyone to read. So companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Microsoft, their response is public. Other companies, notably Meta, NVIDIA, Oracle, Amazon, almost certainly submitted something, but they didn't make it public. So what they're telling the Trump administration, we just don't know, at least not at this stage. With the exception of Meta, because one journalist claims to have gotten a copy of their submission and, reported a little bit of what's in it. Not everything. They didn't leak the whole draft or anything like that. But some of what is supposedly in the Meta submission is in there. So I think the most interesting comments here are in general coming from companies, and that's what we're going to talk about on this podcast. But it's worth noting that like a lot of think tanks, a lot of civil society organizations, a lot of academic institutions also submitted some things, some of which are pretty interesting, but we're just not going to have the time to go into it in here.
Can you give some character around what's the nature of some of the recommendations that they included in them? Yeah,
so again, more than 8,000 responses, and some of these are really long. The OpenAI one is like, I want to say 20 pages, something like that. So more than we're going to talk about here. So I'm going to drill down on a few issues, and anybody who knows my writing work or this podcast knows that I'm a big fan of block quotes. So get ready for some juicy quotes in talking about what we're here. The first thing is I want to point out about OpenAI's response and specifically what they said on DeepSeek. And they connected it to multiple issues, multiple threads of what they were talking about here. But I thought this quote was really interesting. And this is in relation to the use of government data and copyright type issues. Quote, if the Chinese developers, quote, have unfettered access to data and American companies are left without fair use access, the race for AI is effectively over. So think about that in terms of, copyright constraints. The OpenAI is currently facing a lawsuit from the New York Times, who's basically saying, hey, you hoovered up all of our articles for use in your training data to the extent, that we were able to coax your models into reproducing New York Times articles almost verbatim. That's all copyrighted content. That's all stuff that we still make money off through our archive. You have unduly gotten access to this content. And, similarly, if you ask, a lot of these models, hey, draw me a Disney scene from the movie Aladdin, oftentimes they'll say no. But if you say, draw me a mid-90s motion picture about a genie and a young boy in the Arabian Peninsula, who discovers a lamp, it'll show you something, right, that looks a lot like a Disney cartoon. So you can sort of infer that this is part of the training data set. And while there are stipulations in these models that are designed to be legitimate with copyright, a lot of this is still unsettled in courts, unsettled in American law at the federal level and at the state level. And so what OpenAI is basically saying is, look, China doesn't give a crap about our intellectual property protections, right? They are obviously going to hoover up all of this data. They're going to make it available. So if the race in AI, where data is one of the key strategic sources of advantage, if the race is American AI companies not just, having to abide by fair use restrictions, but having to abide by, extremely intense intellectual property protections that sort of go beyond what the technology can actually accommodate in terms of delivering high quality performance. And Chinese companies don't have to do that, we're going to lose. And so I think it's worth throwing, we were talking about this in the context of fair use, but this is going to come up again and again in so many of these companies' submissions, is they're basically saying, we acknowledge that we're in a race with China. We understand that you, the Trump administration, have the goal of winning the quote unquote AI race against China. And so all of our recommendations are consistent with that kind of goal. And they tease that through again and again. So we were just talking about it in the context of fair use, which many companies, including Meta, had submissions related to how they wanted clarifications around copyright type stuff. Another area where, of course, the China competition angle comes up is in export controls. And so here is where I think it's really interesting. We have OpenAI supporting, with some caveats, the AI diffusion rule. So this was one of the last batches of Biden administration export controls. It's pretty controversial because it separates all the countries of the world into 3 tiers that operate under 3 different categories of export license restrictions, with China, North Korea, et cetera, getting nothing, tier 1 getting everything with very few restrictions, and tier 2 getting an awful lot, but with some restrictions and provisions. So OpenAI now on the record saying we propose maintaining the AI diffusion rules 3-tiered framework to differentiate among countries in the global AI market, but with some key modifications that expand the number of countries in tier 1. And then they also propose revisions to tier 2 and say basically we should, quote, limit tier 2 to only those countries that have a history of failing to prevent export-controlled chips and other U.S.-developed IP from being diverted into or used by tier 3 countries, meaning China, et cetera. And then tier 3, and I think this is worth just pointing out, CCP-led China, CCP meaning Chinese Communist Party, along with a small cohort of countries aligned with the CCP, would represent its own category that is prohibited from accessing democratic AI systems.
Wow.
So the national security lens from AI, OpenAI is just completely embracing that.
Yeah.
And while that was certainly true in various parts of the Biden administration and even the first Trump administration, nothing so full-throated as what we're seeing here. Okay, just going to keep going to some other companies because I think what they said about export controls is interesting.
Sure.
Anthropic, they said, quote, Amongst other things, we recommend the administration consider controlling the H20 chips. So these are the degraded version of NVIDIA chips that are still legal to sell in China right now.
Are those the ones that they're saying DeepSeek was trained off of?
So not trained off of. So the trained off one is the H800. That was made illegal in the October 2023 update to the export controls. But what NVIDIA came back out with after the October 2023 update was the H20 chip, which according to some pretty good analysis by Epic AI, is not great as a training chip, but it is pretty good as an inference chip. And as more and more of the AI-related workloads shift from training to inference, it matters a lot. And according to the reporting out there right now, NVIDIA is selling a whole heck of a lot of these H20 chips to China.
Okay.
So then Anthropic's recommendation goes on to say, quote, requiring countries to sign government-to-government agreements outlining measures to prevent smuggling, closely examine and reduce the 1700 H100 no license required threshold for orders to tier 2 countries in the diffusion rule. And here's my favorite part. Increase funding for the Bureau of Industry and Security for export control enforcement. So the fact that they want to reduce the 1700 threshold, that's the number of chips that you can sell to tier 2 countries with no license required. That's a heck of a lot of chips. I mean, that's what, most university departments are going to want. That's what most startups are going to want. And those folks can now buy it with no export licenses. And conceivably, if you were to sort of bundle enough together of these 1,700 chip orders, you could get to a capacity that is interesting from an export control smuggling operation kind of perspective. And Anthropic, getting into the weeds of the policy here, basically saying, shrink that. Nobody else said that. Okay, the last one that I want to talk about on the export controls side of the equation was Meta. So Meta's submission is not actually open and in the public, but their submission was leaked to Platformer. And according to that reporting, it includes the following quote. Open source models are essential for the U.S. to win the race against China and ensure American AI dominance. Export controls on open source models would take the U.S. out of that race, allowing Chinese companies like DeepSeek to set the AI standard on which the world builds and embedding authoritarian values in the global tech ecosystem. And I think it's worth pointing out, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, at one point offered Xi Jinping the opportunity to name his child, right? So Meta has gone from really trying to figure out a way to crack into the Chinese market, which is heavily protected, right? All the tech giants are basically prohibited from operating in China and have been for many decades. Meta was, trying to figure out a way that they could operate in China, abiding by local censorship laws. At least for now, in their messaging to the Trump administration, they've given up on that dream. They sort of recognize that China is never going to let them in. And because China, therefore, has nothing to offer them financially, although Meta does make some money from Chinese companies buying ads on Meta that are served to customers outside of China. But nevertheless, right, Meta willing to take a pretty full-throated stance against Chinese government as an authoritarian structure. They did not, at least not in the quotes that were leaked to the Platformer, make a statement on whether or not they support export controls on AI hardware. They're obviously opposing export controls on open source models. I can only say that in the rumor mill of DC, so this is not something that's confirmed or hard, but I've heard that Meta's government relations folks are now supportive of export controls on AI hardware. Again, they haven't said anything on the record as to that thing, so this is sort of in the category of rumor. But it's something that I really would have loved to see their submission, to see did they take a hard stance on hardware, and at least not in the excerpts that have been made available publicly. Scale AI and Palantir also unsurprisingly supportive of export controls, but Scale AI in a way that I think is kind of interesting, emphasizing beefing up enforcement of existing controls and, getting a hold on what we've already undertaken. So all really kind of interesting points there on export controls.
So it sounds...
Sorry, one more thing I forgot to say here, and I realize I'm dumping a lot on you, Brielle, so I apologize. But the Microsoft and Google submissions never mentioned export controls. And I think in that regard, it's sort of interesting that they don't see it as useful to them to talk about this publicly, at least not in their submission here. Worth noting, of course, that Microsoft did have their vice chair and president, Brad Smith, put out that blog post not that long ago on the diffusion framework, which did not recommend abandoning it, but did recommend some pretty significant revisions to it.
Sure.
So they didn't repeat that argument here, but that's at least out there and noteworthy.
Sure. So it seems like all of these companies that you just talked about, interpreted winning the AI race and AI dominance in multiple different ways: fair use, export controls, software, hardware, that kind of stuff. But what does this mean for those distilling the RFI responses? What is the next step in the implementation of this AI action plan?
Well, there's more I want to talk about what's in these RFI responses. But to answer your question, they are basically going to have to decide what's going to go in this forthcoming Trump administration executive order, the quote unquote AI action plan. So, the president has the power to direct the federal agencies to do things. So if you think about, for example, the Biden administration's executive order on energy, a lot of that was on exercising the executive branch agency's waiver authority related to certain kind of environmental restrictions so that we could build more power generation capacity, more data center generation capacity. So those are the kinds of things that are like within the executive branch's remit. And when you have an executive order, you're basically saying within the authorities, that I have, here is what I want federal agencies to go do. And then there's the question of like, what can you do with executive authority versus what requires congressional authority? Obviously, new appropriations, new sources of money, all of that kind of stuff requires Congress to weigh in. But we've seen every presidential administration, be increasingly emboldened to run more of their policymaking agenda through executive orders just because Congress has been so gridlocked that presidents, want to do something. And boy, does President Trump have an expansive interpretation of executive authority. And so I think we're going to expect a lot from this executive order, this forthcoming executive order. Okay. Sure. Two other things I want to talk about in what's in these RFI responses. The first is around state and local policymaking. So obviously you would think sort of like the federal government, is not necessarily in charge of what state and local governments do, but multiple companies, according to some reporting by the New York Times, have been asking the Trump administration, hey, we are really worried about there being 50 different AI regulatory frameworks in all of America's states. Number one, we want these regulations to be good, which in many cases means a light touch, at least according to the definitions of these companies. But we also just want them to be the same. Even if hypothetically, 50 states came up with 50 different frameworks that were justifiable, just the difference alone, bears its own compliance costs and difficulties. And so they're asking the federal government to get involved either in preempting some of these state actions, and that could be through the power to persuade or the power to coerce. And they're also asking them to just also make sure that the regulations are relatively light to the extent that they can. The final area that I think is worth calling out in these RFI responses is around governance and safety. So we've seen a lot of changes in this debate. I think one thing that happened recently that I thought was noteworthy was that Elon Musk went on Senator Ted Cruz's podcast and said that he still believes that there is a 20% chance that AI will lead to the extinction of humanity. So, like I said, that's a view that he has been expressing consistently and publicly since I want to say like 2012. So Elon Musk clearly believes this. He believed this before he was involved with any AI companies whatsoever. He still believes it now. And so what does that mean for AI safety? I mean, I would say XAI, among all the AI model developers out there, has like by far the lightest safety provisions. We've just run some simple tests here, nothing especially rigorous. But Grok just doesn't say no that often. And that can be whether you want it to engage in conversations that verge on pornography or whether you want to ask it stuff about bioweapons development. It just really very, very rarely refuses to do anything. Whereas a lot of those other models say like, hey, I'm happy to help you with this, but I can't help you with that.
Right.
So there's a little bit of a split personality, right, between Elon Musk's words and the type of stuff that he's doing with his own company. But at least, what we're seeing so far is that the companies are still on board with the ideas behind AI safety, although many of them have dropped the word AI safety. Not all, but some. And there's also, interesting support, that's present for the AI Safety Institute. So Anthropic, for example, came out said explicitly, preserve the AI Safety Institute, and also advance the state-of-the-art and third-party testing of AI systems for national security risks. So
that was in their RFI?
That was in their RFI response.
Wow.
Yes. And then you have Microsoft, which in its RFI response said, quote, build on U.S. AI research leadership via global AI institutes. The United States should remain involved in conversations with other AI safety and security institutes around the world to ensure American values are represented and integrated into the development of international AI standards and enabling research. This collaboration will also help foster innovation by safeguarding against misuse of AI technologies. So what Microsoft is basically saying is like, hey, if you want us to be a leader in AI around the world, that means we have to be a leader in the key conversations that are happening around the world, including on the development of standards related to safety and security. So I would say that's not only Microsoft's endorsement of the U.S. AI Safety Institute, that's Microsoft's endorsement of the U.S.-led International AI Safety Institute network,
right?
One of the foreign policy dimensions of this network. So it's not so much that they're embracing the word safety, which, as we talked about on this podcast a lot of times, is deeply controversial in Republican politics. But some of those ideas around like, look, these standards are going to get developed. Whether or not you use the word safety, these standards are going to get developed. These are something that our companies are going to have to deal with as they try and go succeed in exporting American technology abroad. And the government can help us, right? Like this is one of those weird circumstances, in my view anyway, where if your goal as the Trump administration is to minimize the burden facing U.S. companies in terms of AI regulation, then the optimum amount of safety work and regulatory work and those kind of initiatives to do in the U.S. federal government is not zero. Because if you do zero, then the Europeans will probably adopt a more maximalist approach than they would have otherwise done. I realize this is kind of counterintuitive, but you kind of need a strong negotiating position.
Sure.
And so if, the Europeans are basically looking to whack American tech companies as punishment, then the actual sort of net global regulatory burden on American companies could be quite a bit higher than if the United States is a leader in these conversations. And we've seen this, play out where regulatory frameworks like GDPR, Europe's privacy law, found its way to places in South America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. And it's so, as I said, if you want American companies to experience less regulation, getting rid of the U.S. AI Safety Institute would be a really dumb move because it basically gives the United States a much weaker negotiating position in showing itself as a responsible actor and that there are viable alternatives to draconian regulatory standards. So there's 8,000 plus responses to this RFI. I did not read all of them. There's more stuff that we could go into that's interesting, but at least for the purposes of this podcast, that's what I thought was really important for our listeners to get.
Yeah, sure. It sounds like from the sample that you just walked us through, there's 3 primary areas they're looking at: hard power, soft power, and this please allow us to work within all the states effectively as well. It'll be interesting to see what the Trump administration pulls together from all of those 8,000 plus responses. I'm glad that I'm not on that team and that we get to sort of talk about it here on the podcast. And I'm sure we
get to choose which ones to read.
Exactly.
Theoretically, the government is supposed to read all of them.
Right, exactly. So, but I'm sure we'll be back on the podcast to talk about that EO when it does drop.
Yep.
Okay, let's...
And I guess it's worth pointing out there is a date here.
Okay.
So the due date for this one is July 22nd, 2025. the AI action plan, is due 180 days after that initial executive order was issued, which is how you get to that July 22nd date. They could theoretically beat that, but just usually bureaucracies take all the time that's available to them as a general rule.
Makes sense. Well, regardless, we'll be back in a few months to talk about it. I want to move stateside now and talk about the Joint California Policy Working Group on AI Frontier Models. So on March 18th, that working group released their first draft. Greg, can you tell us what the purpose of this working group is and what their key findings were?
Yeah, so this is an interesting report that was sort of commissioned by California's governor, Gavin Newsom, in September 2024. And it kind of came in the aftermath of the failure of California's bill, SB 1047. And that was a big AI safety bill. It was sort of the most noteworthy bill, honestly, in the world that was concerned with frontier model AI safety type provisions. So, Newsom blocked that bill, but he didn't want to say, hey, I'm going to do nothing on AI safety. And so he basically, got together this group of experts and said, hey, I want you to write a report on what I should do, acknowledging that bill is not what I want to do. And so who did he get to run that? He got Dr. Fei-Fei Li, co-director of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI and very well known in AI circles as the creator of the ImageNet Challenge, which is in 2012 is where a lot of this sort of deep learning revolution really started to take off. It's all got Tino Cellular, who is the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but at least for the purposes of this document, I think his more relevant qualification is that he used to be a justice on the California State Supreme Court, which is a super important Supreme Court in cases of tech liability law types of lawsuits.
That makes sense.
So he has a lot of judicial experience around that flavor of AI regulation and tech regulation in general. And then finally, Dr. Jennifer Tour-Chase, I'm probably saying that name wrong, so I apologize, but she's dean of the Berkeley College of Computing, Data Science, and Society. So the whole mandate for this report is to develop an effective approach to support the development, use, and governance of generative AI, including the development of suitable guardrails to minimize material risks. So basically, tell me what I should do on AI safety, given that I'm not going to do SB 1047.
Is there something interesting about that makeup of the working group? It's all civil society. Obviously, you talked about the individuals within that, but why not industry as a part of that?
Well, I think that what they're kind of looking for is an objective, unbiased opinion, not sort of weighted by material interests. And, Fei-Fei Li was at one point an executive at Google, and of course, being at Stanford and also Dr. Tour-Chase, who being at UC Berkeley, right? Both of those institutions have really strong ties to industry that matter a lot to them. But nevertheless, I think he was looking for something that was objective, grounded in an understanding of the technology, grounded in understanding of the law, and would actually be implementable and not, by somebody whose stock options are going to be worth more, right? If AI does X, Y, Z.
Yeah, so we talked about the reaction to that bill when it was sort of circulating around and being decided on. But what has the reaction been to this report in the AI policy? Or actually, let's take a step back. What did the report find?
Yeah, so the report is structured in kind of an interesting way. It's not like there's like a recommendations section per se. What there are these 8 key principles for policymaking. And some of them, and I know the authors of this report, and I like the authors of this report, so I don't want to, sound mean. But some of these principles are kind of like, duh. So for example, principle 1 is consistent with available evidence and sound principles of policy analysis, targeted interventions to support effective AI governance should balance the technology's benefits and material risks.
Sure.
Which, I suppose not balancing benefits and risks is a viable option that one could choose. I don't support it. So I guess it does perhaps need saying, but, not the ideal. So in that regard, the findings, not earth-shattering. But there was some pretty interesting stuff, even in the principle section, as you go a little bit lower. So I would point to, for example, principle 6, which said, quote, whistleblower protections, third-party evaluations, and public-facing information sharing are key instruments to increase transparency. So whistleblower protections, that's something that had been, kind of controversial. It was included in SB 1047. Not everybody liked the idea of including in SB 1047. Not everybody liked the mechanism by which they, implemented in SB 1047. But here it is in this report basically saying, whatever you end up doing, you should have whistleblower protections. You should have third-party evaluations. So that's kind of interesting, right? That we've got that kind of authoritative thing. The seventh principle, adverse event reporting systems enable monitoring of the post-deployment impacts of AI and commensurate modernization of existing regulatory or enforcement authorities. So not the most eloquently worded principle, but adverse event reporting systems. Basically, is there a mechanism whereby we can get these AI companies to say when something bad happens with their system, where they are incentivized to do that? Because kind of what you want to avoid here is the situation that we faced in cybersecurity for a very long time, where all of the financial incentives of a company, when you experience a material cyber breach, is to cover it up, deny that it ever happened, et cetera, right? Because you freak out your customers, et cetera. So what the government needed was what's some mechanism, because it's really important to national security. It's really important for, other companies that are potential victims of the same category of attack, that there's an incentive to share information when attacks do occur. And so they're basically saying, hey, we want the same kind of incentive structure to apply when it comes to AI safety or security related incidents.
Sure.
And then the final one on principle number 8, thresholds for policy interventions, such as for disclosure requirements, third-party assessment, or adverse event reporting, should be designed to align with sound governance goals. And again, this is kind of a duh, right? Imagine the opposite recommendation should be designed to align with unsound governance goals.
Sure.
It's okay. But I do think it's interesting that they're sort of saying that disclosure requirements, third-party assessment, adverse event reporting, those are all things that we want, but we want them in some kind of calibrated fashions, not some kind of unlimited fashion. And so that's what I think is kind of the interesting aspect of that principle. Then the report also just had some interesting takes, right? Because they were sort of also responsible for sort of saying what is credible given the certain state of AI technology and where we appear to be heading, what is not credible. So this is sort of an authoritative voice weighing in on which scenarios are plausible or implausible, and doing so in a way that sort of comes with a good deal of government gravitas. And I thought that was interesting.
So then what are some of those takes?
So I think one deals with artificial general intelligence, right? And we've got a lot of the big tech CEOs sort of saying, hey, in the not too distant future, we're going to have AI that's as smart as the smartest human on earth, and it's going to be available everywhere, and it's going to cost $1 a year. So those kind of things. Now we have, some quote unquote authoritative government report describing it. So here we go. The possibility of artificial general intelligence, AGI, which the International AI Safety Report defines as, and this is a quote within a quote, a potential future AI that equals or surpasses human performance on all or almost all cognitive tasks, looms large as an uncertain variable that could shape both the benefits and costs AI will bring. So they didn't quite sort of say this is definitely going to happen, this is definitely not going to happen, but they basically did say whatever policy you make needs to acknowledge the reality that this could happen. This is absolutely credible and plausible, even if it doesn't specifically happen, on any, whatever given time frame. You should be making policy that is relevant for that potential future. And I thought that in and of itself was interesting. The second thing I thought was interesting was what they said on existential risk. So folks will remember that in the middle of 2023, that was that big letter that came out that was signed by a bunch of leading academics, a bunch of leading tech CEOs. Elon Musk signed that letter, and Elon Musk is still out there saying that there's a 20% chance that AI leads to the extinction of humanity. So what did this report say about it? Well, it said that there's, quote, inconclusive evidence, end quote, about the potential for advanced AI to bring extreme threats. However, the report said, and this is interesting because they're talking about what does it mean that there's inconclusive evidence?
Right.
I thought this was really interesting. Quote, we do not need to observe a nuclear weapon, I think they mean exploding, to predict reliably that it could cause and would cause extensive harm. If those who speculate about the most extreme risks are right, and we are uncertain if they will be, then the stakes and costs for inaction on frontier AI at this current moment are extremely high. So I really like what they've said here. Is basically say like, look, the people who are saying that these most significant risks are real, they do not have proof in the form of an AI in a supercomputer somewhere that currently poses an existential risk.
Right.
But that's not what our threshold should be for policymaking, right? Our threshold should be, are these likely? Like, is there reasonable evidence that this could be? And they use that sort of like, we knew that nuclear weapons were real and scary and dangerous before nuclear weapons existed on this earth.
Sure.
So the policymakers sort of need to open their aperture and their appetite for evidence to include stuff other than it already happened. It's already trying to kill us all.
Right.
Kind of a scenario. And I thought that was just a useful frame for all of this. Okay, one final thing that I thought was in this report that was juicy and worthwhile pointing out, which was some skepticism about AI companies and the way that they have approached transparency to date. So here's the quote. Many AI companies in the United States have noted the need for transparency for this world-changing technology. Many have published safety frameworks articulating thresholds that, if passed, will trigger concrete safety-focused actions. Only time will bear out whether these public declarations are matched by a level of actual accountability that allows society writ large to avoid the worst outcomes of this emerging technology, end quote. So they're basically saying, look, we like this transparency. We like what people are pushing for in terms of safety frameworks, but they're worried that there might be this gap between the public messaging and what's actually going on behind the scenes. And I think that's also sort of borne out by their principles talking about the need for third-party evaluations, et cetera. When AI companies say that they're doing an awful lot to bring about safety, that's great. I'm glad they're saying those kinds of things, and I'm certainly rooting for them to succeed. But if you're like a government policymaker, you can't be ignorant that like Theranos is a company that happened, right? There are companies out there that are straight up duplicitous, straight up falsifying, critical data about what their product is and what their product does. And so we need a regulatory regime that does not always and forever just take companies at their word, because we know that there are companies on planet Earth that are willing to lie an awful lot. And so we need a regime that can be robust to that reality and do so without sort of, killing the golden goose of AI innovation. So not that this, report solved any of all that forever, but I did think it had some interesting things to say.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the previous conversations we've had about knowing and showing. And it sounds like, this is right in line with some of those calls for that type of regulation, or at least frameworks moving forward. Okay, so then how have you been reacting to this? How have our counterparts at other think tanks been reacting to this? How is the broader AI community, policy community looking at this?
Well, I think there's one voice here that I thought was the most noteworthy, and that was California State Senator Scott Wiener, who totally endorsed the report and said, quote, "My office is considering which recommendations could be incorporated into SB 53, and I invite all relevant stakeholders to engage with us in that process." So he's basically saying, hey, you didn't like SB 1047. I've got a new bill. It takes into account this report that you commissioned, Governor, when you, said no to my last bill. So how are you possibly going to, with a straight face, say no to me again, right, when my next bill is coming in? So I think there's a path for some of the stuff in this report that includes whistleblower protections, that includes third-party evaluations, that includes transparency requirements. I think a lot of that stuff is going to make its way into the next bill, and then we'll see how that bill makes contact with the current political realities that we're facing, both in Washington and elsewhere.
Sure.
Worth noting that, Anthropic, which as far as AI companies goes, really views itself as sparking a, quote, race to the top in AI safety. They came out just explicitly endorsing this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, a friend of the Wadhwani Center, Dean Ball, who, really comes at this from the right side of the political aisle and has done a lot of work on state and local AI regulation. That's why we had him on the podcast just last week. He's very favorably disposed to this report and sort of says this is pretty interesting, but he called it not that far from a slimmed down SB 1047, which I'm sure is exactly what Senator Scott Wiener has in mind.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. Okay, well, we've talked a lot about the sort of national approach to AI regulations or our policies moving forward, looking more at California and how that may impact some stuff around the nation. We'll be following all of that. I want to get more to how AI is impacting sort of real world jobs as well. On March 14th, the Washington Post released an analysis that found more than a quarter of computer programming jobs have disappeared in the last 2 years. Greg, what are the primary findings of that analysis?
I think it's so remarkable that we've moved from a world in which, I remember people who I respected would give advice to like college undergraduates wondering what they should major in. And they're like, oh, I'm interested in so many different things. And I would hear people I respect be like, yeah, it doesn't matter that you're interested in so many different things. There's a right answer here. The right answer is computer science. If you major in anything else, you're crazy. And that's true, based on the fact that it's a very flexible degree, you can be useful in a lot of different fields, and it's an incredibly lucrative field. But right now, it's a pretty hard time for especially recent graduates in computer science. So, according to this analysis, the 27.5% drop in the 12-month average for total U.S. computer programmer employment. That's a lot. Now, part of that is tied to a surge of hiring around the pandemic. But even so, we had a lot of hiring, but now we're even below the level that we were at before the pandemic. So this is a noteworthy drop in this kind of thing. And I think it's fair to say that it's kind of a coincidence, right, that we're saying a quarter of jobs have disappeared. Well, Google CEO Sundar Pichai recently said that a quarter of all the code that Google puts out right now is being written by AI. So could it be that the first job that AI is coming for in terms of, replacing humans is, ironically enough, the job of computer programmer, including being a computer programmer for creating AI? And it's worth pointing out that there's like a technical reason for this. So, of course, the performance of AI is tied to the amount and the quality of training data that you have. And so if you want to sort of say, hey, go be good at writing Shakespearean sonnets, well, there's no like objective, scorecard for this is a 100 out of 100 Shakespearean sonnet and this is a 75 out of 100 Shakespearean sonnet. So you really have to rely upon human feedback and scoring of what counts as a quality response or not quality response. And there's only so many humans on planet Earth who can spend so many hours per day scoring Shakespearean sonnets. And how good are they even going to be at scoring that? If you contrast that with something like computer code, there are objective verification things that you can tie the computer code outputted by an AI model to in the real world. You can basically say, number one, does this code compile or does it like throw up a big error? And then two, for certain categories of computer code, if I said, go create me a calculator, well, when I tell it to add 2 + 2, does the calculator spit out the answer 4?
Right.
And so the fact that there is an opportunity for formal verification basically means that you can create unlimited quantities of synthetic training data tied to that formal verification. And that's why the performance of generative AI systems in this domain are advancing so much faster than in all other domains, where they're also advancing pretty fast. And so you've got folks like Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, saying that by the end of this year, most or all computer code is going to be written by AIs. You've got Mark Zuckerberg saying that he thinks AI is going to be a credible candidate for a mid-level engineering job at Meta by the end of this year. So it's already extremely good. It already appears to be having an impact on the labor market. And you could see a world where it has a very significant impact on the labor market in the future. At least for right now, this is all taking the form, at least in my sense, of productivity enhancing tools.
Sure.
It's just that those people who are benefiting are being so much more productive that they're influencing the overall labor market. And one scenario here is that demand also goes up as price falls, right? Would I want to hire a software engineer to join my team? Maybe not, because how much are they going to do and how much am I going to have to pay them?
Sure.
But if they could do 1,000 times more than they can currently do in terms of software engineering, well, for the same price, maybe I would hire someone who's like 1,000 times more productive. So we could sort of see the labor market dynamic shift in response to the productivity and cost sort of a thing. And there'll be winners and losers in this exchange. So I don't know that we know what the long-term outcomes are. But at least in the short-term outcomes, it's a tough year for computer programmers.
That makes sense. However, even more short term, our last bit of exciting news here is that the Wadhwani AI Center is hiring again. And we are looking forward to hiring an excellent deputy director / senior fellow. Greg, can you tell us a little bit more about what this role will be and how they will interact with our team?
Yeah, so if you like the work of the Wadhwani AI Center, if you care about AI policy, if you are a U.S. citizen who is willing to work in the office 5 days a week, I do hope you will consider coming to work at the Wadhwani Center as our Deputy Director and Senior Fellow. This job application is up on CSIS.org. You can go apply. And the full requirements and duties of the position are up there on the website. To be super short and sweet, what I'll say right now is you've got to be an amazing writer and researcher. You've got to be an amazing editor of other folks who are doing writing and research here at the center. You've got to be able to get government officials to care about your scholarship. We don't like to just write reports and publish them into a void. We try to have a real impact here at the Wadhwani Center. And you have to be, credible in terms of fundraising, engaging with the media, all of those kinds of duties. And we're really looking for somebody who's going to be a mentor to our junior research staff who are, trying to get their feet wet in this field and can take people's good work and help make it better in the course of editing process. And you've got to love being a part of a team because we here at the Wadhwani Center work really hard, run really fast, and we're looking for somebody who can be a part of that culture and take it to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. And a great first step is listening to the AI Policy Podcast. If you like the work that we do here, you're probably aligned with some of the work that we plan to do in the future. But another next great step is to check out our recent analysis, including an exceptional report called The Understanding U.S. Allies' Current Legal Authority to Implement AI and Semiconductor Export Controls. And I think a requirement is that all of our titles have to be super long as well. But that's written by Gregory C. Allen and Isaac Goldston on our team. This report explores the legal tools and policy frameworks shaping Allied export controls and the challenges of aligning them with U.S. national security requirements. You can check out the job description that we talked about. You can check out that analysis and more on CSIS.org. We'll also link those in today's show notes. But Greg, I believe that's it for this episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me and for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great talking with you, Brielle. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. If you like what you heard, there's an easy way for you to help us. Please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe. And tell your friends. It really helps spread the word. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Isaac Goldston, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.